The truth behind the New Mexico outlaw known as Billy the Kid shatters the Hollywood myth of a teenage hero. His most notorious crime wasn't an honorable duel. It was the cold-blooded execution of two lawmen during a brutal jailbreak. Earning a massive $500 bounty for his 8 verified kills, he operated strictly as a ruthless cattle rustler. The infamous gunslinger didn't die in a blaze of glory. Hunted down by Sheriff Pat Garrett, the 21-year-old was shot dead in a pitch-black room before he even had the chance to draw his weapon. This is the unvarnished reality of the Wild West. In the early 1860s, the east side of New York City was a labyrinth of overcrowded tenements, open sewers, and rampant disease. It was a holding pen for desperate immigrants fleeing starvation. Here, Catherine McCarty, an Irish Catholic immigrant, fought a daily war of attrition against poverty. The historical record regarding Henry's biological father is practically non-existent, leaving Catherine as the sole architect of her family's survival. She navigated a landscape where cholera and typhus routinely decimated the tenement blocks. Henry McCarty was born into this environment of constant grinding scarcity. He inherited the trauma of the displaced urban poor. The relentless pressure of the slums forced Catherine to join the mass migration westward. Driven by destitution, Catherine joined the mass migration westward. By 1870, Catherine had moved Henry and his younger brother Joseph to Indianapolis and subsequently to Wichita, Kansas. The frontier towns of the era were chaotic supply hubs for the cattle trade, characterized by mud streets, transient populations, and the constant influx of capital from eastern syndicates. In Wichita, Catherine established a laundry business, a grueling physical occupation that required boiling water over open fires and scrubbing heavy dirt-caked garments for hours on end. During this period, she met and married William Antrim, a man whose primary defining characteristic was an all-consuming, ultimately fruitless obsession with gold prospecting. Antrim was not a father figure to Henry. He was an intermittent presence, constantly abandoning the family to chase rumors of mineral wealth in the mountains. The family dynamic was fractured, held together solely by Catherine's deteriorating physical strength. In 1873, the family relocated again, this time to the high desert terrain of Silver City, New Mexico. Silver City was a boomtown, an industrial scar carved into the mountains, existing solely to extract wealth for distant investors. The air was thick with pulverized rock from the stamping mills and the constant dust kicked up by freight wagons. It was the worst possible environment for a woman whose lungs were failing. Catherine McCarty had contracted tuberculosis, known then as consumption. The progression of tuberculosis in the 19th century was a slow, agonizing suffocation. The bacteria methodically destroyed the lung tissue. Henry, now an adolescent, watched his mother's body waste away. He witnessed the violent, bloody coughing fits and the relentless fever. Catherine's laundry business collapsed as she became bedridden. On September 16, 1874, Catherine McCarty died in a cramped adobe house. She was 34 years old. Henry was 14. The death of his mother was the critical rupture in Henry's life. William Antrim's reaction to his wife's death was immediate abandonment. He placed Henry and Joseph in separate foster homes and left Silver City to resume his prospecting, permanently severing his ties with the boys. At 14, Henry was entirely unmoored. discarded by the only family structure he had ever known. He was placed in the care of Sarah Brown, the owner of a local boarding house, and was put to work washing dishes and waiting tables. The contrast was stark and immediate. Henry, a slight malnourished orphan, spent his days cleaning up after wealthy mine managers, cattle barons, and professional gamblers. The boarding house and the surrounding saloons offered an unvarnished view of the local hierarchy. Power and respect were not earned through hard work. They were dictated by capital and the willingness to use violence. Henry gravitated toward the saloons, seeking the warmth and chaotic community of the transient population. He absorbed the language, the mannerisms, and the casual brutality of the drifters. His transition into the criminal underworld began with petty opportunistic theft, not grand banditry. In late 1875, Henry began associating with a local petty criminal named George Schaffer, known in the saloons as Sombrero Jack. Schaffer was an alcoholic thief who preyed on the margins of Silver City's economy. In September of that year, Schaffer broke into a Chinese laundry operated by Charlie Sun and Sam Chung, stealing a large bundle of clothing. Schaffer did not keep the stolen goods. He manipulated the 15-year-old Henry into hiding the bundle in his boarding house room. The theft was quickly discovered. The local authorities did not view Henry as a criminal mastermind. Sheriff Harvey Whitehill arrested the teenager, viewing the incident as a minor juvenile offense. Whitehill locked Henry in the local jail cell, intending to hold him for a few days to frighten him and teach him a lesson about associating with vagrants. It was a standard low-level disciplinary measure. The sheriff severely underestimated the psychological impact of confinement on the orphan teenager. The physical reality of the locked cell, the isolation, and the looming threat of the legal system triggered a desperate survival instinct. Henry was exceptionally small for his age, wiry and agile. During the night, he examined the architecture of his confinement. The cell possessed a large, rough-hewn brick chimney. Ignoring the soot and the physical abrasion, Henry squeezed his body into the narrow flue. He systematically wedged his knees and back against the brickwork, inching his way upward in the absolute darkness. He dragged himself out of the chimney cap, dropped onto the roof, and fled into the high desert night. This physical escape marked a permanent psychological boundary. By climbing up that chimney, Henry McCarty severed his final tether to civil society. He could not return to his dishwashing job. He could not seek refuge with the local families. He was now a fugitive from the law, however minor the initial charge. He walked out of Silver City with nothing but the clothes on his back, entering a brutal landscape where survival depended entirely on his ability to adapt to a lawless environment. For the next 2 years, from 1875 to 1877, Henry drifted through the desolate expanses of the Arizona Territory. He worked intermittently as a ranch hand, a teamster, and a saddle tramp. The labor was physically punishing, and the compensation was starvation wages. The American Southwest during this period was highly militarized and violently contested, marked by ongoing conflicts with the Apache and ruthless competition between cattle syndicates. In this environment, a teenage drifter held zero social value. Henry sought refuge in the only institutions that welcomed transients, the gambling halls and saloons of the frontier military outposts. At Camp Grant, a military installation surrounded by a parasitic cluster of brothels and bars, Henry's immersion into the criminal underclass accelerated. He developed a severe addiction to gambling, routinely losing his meager wages at the Monte and Faro tables. The saloons were hyper-masculine arenas where status was enforced through intimidation and violence. Henry, lacking physical stature, learned to compensate with a sharp tongue and a studied, icy demeanor. He began carrying a revolver, not as a prop, but as an essential tool for basic physical security. The catalyst that transformed Henry from a petty thief into a killer occurred in August 1877. The event was devoid of romance or cinematic tension. It was a squalid, drunken brawl inside George Adkins's dance hall and saloon in the settlement of Bonita, near Camp Grant. Frank Windy Cahill was a civilian blacksmith contracted by the military. Physically, Cahill was massive, a broad-shouldered, heavy-set man who utilized his size to intimidate the smaller men in the settlement. He routinely targeted Henry, mocking his slight build, his youth, and his poverty. Cahill relentlessly bullied the teenager, calling him a pimp and slapping him across the face in front of the saloon patrons. Henry absorbed the humiliation, recognizing the severe physical disparity. On the evening of August 17th, the verbal abuse escalated. The saloon was crowded, smelling of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Cahill cornered Henry, hurling insults. The tension snapped. Henry responded with a verbal provocation. Cahill lunged forward, his massive weight crashing into the teenager. He tackled Henry to the wooden floorboards, pinning him down and raining heavy blows onto his face and torso, pinned beneath a man twice his size, suffocating under the physical assault. Henry did not fight fair. He reached for the Colt revolver tucked into his waistband. This was not a quick draw at 20 paces. It was a desperate, point-blank execution born of pure panic and survival instinct. Henry pressed the barrel of the revolver into Cahill's abdomen and pulled the trigger. The heavy lead bullet tore through Cahill's stomach, instantly destroying his internal organs. The concussive blast of the gunshot in the enclosed space deafened the patrons. Cahill rolled off the teenager, clutching his shattered abdomen, screaming in agony. Blood rapidly soaked into the sawdust on the floor. Henry did not hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the chaotic shouting of the crowd. He ran out the back door of the saloon, stole a horse tethered to a nearby post, and vanished into the darkness of the Arizona desert. Frank Cahill agonized through the night and died the following day. Henry McCarty was no longer a runaway orphan or a petty thief. At 17 years old, he had taken a human life. He had crossed a threshold that fundamentally altered his trajectory. Fleeing back toward the New Mexico territory, knowing that a murder charge hung over him, he discarded his birth name. The boy from the New York slums ceased to exist. As he rode toward Lincoln County, a region heavily polarized by corporate warfare and deeply entrenched corruption, he began introducing himself as William H. Bonney. The machine of violence had been fully primed, and he was riding directly toward the center of the conflict. The landscape of Lincoln County, New Mexico, in the late 1870s was a vast, unforgiving expanse of high desert, scrub oak, and jagged canyons. It was not a haven for rugged individualists seeking freedom. It was a highly structured, violently enforced corporate monopoly. The economic lifeblood of the entire region, government contracts to supply beef to Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation, was controlled entirely by a mercantile operation known locally as the House. Founded by Irish immigrants Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, the House dictated the price of goods, controlled the local banking, and essentially owned the legal infrastructure. The local law enforcement, led by Sheriff William Brady, functioned as a private security force for the Murphy-Dolan syndicate. The American frontier here was merely a stage for an aggressive form of late 19th century capitalism, a system where the wealthy consolidated power and the poor provided the cheap disposable muscle. Into this volatile economic ecosystem rode the 17-year-old fugitive from Arizona, now operating under the alias William H. Bonney. Arriving destitute with only a stolen horse and a revolver, he harbored no grand illusions of frontier justice. The absolute monopoly of the House was being challenged by a massive influx of foreign capital. John Tunstall, a wealthy 24-year-old English investor, arrived in Lincoln with the explicit goal of dismantling the Murphy-Dolan operation. Tunstall built a rival mercantile store, established a competing bank, and aggressively bid on the lucrative government beef contracts. This was not a clash of moral ideologies. It was a hostile corporate takeover backed by substantial financial resources. Tunstall recognized that in a territory where the local sheriff was on the rival payroll, he needed his own armed contingent. He began hiring transient cowboys, drifters, and men running from the law. He offered them room, board, and a meager wage in exchange for their physical presence and their willingness to pull a trigger. Henry McCarty was assimilated into this workforce. He was not a beloved confidant to the English aristocrat. He was an expendable asset, hired for his proficiency with a firearm. The friction between the two corporate entities escalated rapidly from legal maneuvering to physical violence. The breaking point occurred on February 18, 1878. John Tunstall, accompanied by a small escort that included Henry McCarty, was driving a herd of horses toward Lincoln. They were intercepted by a heavily armed posse deputized by Sheriff Brady, a posse consisting of House loyalists and notorious local enforcers. The posse did not attempt an arrest. They isolated Tunstall from his men, shot him in the chest, and then fired a second point-blank round into his head as he lay on the ground. They subsequently shot his horse, arranging the bodies in a grotesque tableau. Henry and the other ranch hands, outgunned and positioned at a distance, watched the execution from a nearby ridge. The murder of John Tunstall triggered a profound psychological shift in the young fugitive. He witnessed firsthand that the badge of a lawman offered no guarantee of justice. It was merely a shield used by one capitalist faction to eliminate a rival. In response, the surviving Tunstall employees, guided by Tunstall's business partner, Alexander McSween, sought their own legal veneer. They secured deputization from a sympathetic justice of the peace and branded themselves the regulators. Their stated objective was to serve arrest warrants on Tunstall's killers. Their practical function was a heavily armed hit squad. The ensuing conflict, known historically as the Lincoln County War, was a sequence of ambushes, sieges, and assassinations. It lacked the romanticized honor of cinematic gunfights. The defining moment of Henry McCarty's involvement in this war, the event that permanently branded him a high-value target, occurred on the morning of April 1st, 1878. The architecture of Lincoln consisted of a single dusty thoroughfare lined with adobe structures. On the eastern end of the town stood the Tunstall store. Attached to the store was a corral enclosed by a thick adobe wall. An adobe wall is dense, capable of stopping high-caliber rifle rounds, and offers absolute concealment. Sheriff William Brady, accompanied by 4 deputies, walked eastward down the center of the dirt street. They were heavily armed, moving toward the courthouse. They did not know they were walking into a predetermined kill zone. Behind the adobe wall of the Tunstall Corral, Henry McCarty and 5 other regulators waited in complete silence. They had carved small loopholes through the dried mud and straw of the wall. They rested the barrels of their Winchester rifles and Sharps carbines in these slots. Instead of issuing a formal challenge or stepping into the street, they waited in silence until Sheriff Brady and his men were directly parallel to their position, fully exposed in the open street, their backs turned to the corral. The volley of rifle fire was instantaneous and deafening. Multiple high-velocity rounds tore through the morning air. Sheriff Brady was struck simultaneously by several bullets in the back and torso. The kinetic energy of the heavy lead rounds threw him forward into the dirt. He died instantly, his blood pooling rapidly in the dry New Mexico dust. Deputy George Heineman was struck in the neck and back, collapsing near the town's irrigation ditch, mortally wounded. The remaining deputies scrambled for cover, returning erratic, panicked fire toward the corral wall. In the chaotic seconds following the assassination, Henry McCarty broke cover. Driven by either an adrenaline-fueled impulse or a desire for a trophy, he vaulted the adobe wall and sprinted into the open street toward the corpse of Sheriff Brady. He intended to strip the dead lawman of his custom-made Winchester rifle. As Henry crouched over the body, grasping the weapon, one of the surviving deputies fired from behind a nearby structure. The bullet struck Henry in the thigh, tearing through the muscle. The sharp physical shock broke his concentration. He dropped the rifle, scrambled back over the adobe wall, and the regulators mounted their horses, fleeing the town before a larger posse could be organized. This calculated, cold-blooded ambush of a government official completely shattered any romantic illusions of frontier justice. The violence was transactional, a retaliatory strike designed to cripple the enforcement arm of the rival syndicate. The assassination of Sheriff Brady escalated the corporate proxy war to a level of national visibility. The violence raged through the spring and summer, culminating in a devastating 5-day siege in July 1878. The regulators, including Henry, were trapped inside the sprawling adobe home of Alexander McSween in the center of Lincoln. The House faction, supported by a heavily armed detachment of United States cavalry equipped with a Gatling gun and a mountain howitzer, surrounded the property. The military intervention signaled the absolute collapse of the Tunstall-McSween faction. The capitalists backing the House had successfully utilized federal troops to crush their rivals. On the final night of the siege, the attackers set the McSween home on fire. The flames consumed the wooden roof and interior framing, turning the adobe structure into a suffocating furnace. The men trapped inside were forced to choose between burning to death or running into a concentrated barrage of crossfire. Under the cover of darkness and thick, blinding smoke, the regulators made a desperate break for the nearby river. Alexander McSween, the lawyer who had orchestrated the legal fiction of the regulators, was cut down in a hail of bullets as he stepped out the door. Henry McCarty, utilizing his speed and a frantic burst of covering fire, sprinted through the darkness, crossed the river, and vanished into the brush. He survived the physical destruction of his faction, but the trap had been irrevocably sprung. The wealthy investors, the men who had initiated the conflict from comfortable offices in Santa Fe and London, absorbed their financial losses and withdrew. The young men they had hired to execute their violence were left behind to absorb the legal consequences. Henry McCarty, barely 18 years old, was now indicted for the murder of a county sheriff. The corporate war was over, but the machinery of the state was just beginning to process the surviving assets. The destruction of the McSween house in July 1878 effectively ended the Lincoln County War. The wealthy backers retreated, leaving their hired guns to face the legal fallout. Stripped of his deputized status, Henry McCarty was now a common fugitive carrying a federal indictment for the assassination of Sheriff Brady. To pacify the violent territory, the federal government appointed a new governor, Lew Wallace. His mandate was to clear the region of outlaws by offering a blanket amnesty, a deal that explicitly excluded anyone already indicted for murder, leaving the 18-year-old completely isolated. Recognizing this total isolation, the 18-year-old outlaw initiated a sequence of correspondence with Governor Wallace in March 1879. These letters, written in a surprisingly neat practice script, reveal a highly calculated survival strategy. Henry offered a transaction. He would provide eyewitness testimony regarding the unsolved murder of a prominent local attorney, Chapman, if Wallace would annul the murder indictments against him. A clandestine meeting was arranged in the village of Lincoln under the cover of darkness. The physical contrast between the two men in that room defined the power dynamic of the frontier. Wallace was a middle-aged, distinguished military officer acting as the supreme executive authority of the territory. Henry McCarty was a slightly built, unwashed teenager carrying a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver, entirely reliant on his reflexes for survival. Wallace verbally agreed to the transaction. He promised Henry a full gubernatorial pardon in exchange for his testimony. To maintain the illusion of law enforcement, they choreographed a fake arrest. Henry allowed himself to be placed in handcuffs by the local authorities and was held in the Lincoln jail. Henry fulfilled his end of the contract. He stood before a territorial grand jury and provided detailed, damning testimony that led to the indictment of several high-ranking enforcers from the Murphy-Dolan faction. He handed Wallace the exact legal ammunition the governor needed to publicly demonstrate that the territory was being brought under control. Once the grand jury concluded, Wallace boarded a stagecoach back to his administrative headquarters in Santa Fe. He did not sign the pardon. He did not issue an order for Henry's release. The governor had extracted the necessary data to satisfy his political superiors and simply abandoned the teenage gunman in a jail cell to face the gallows. Henry waited for several weeks, realizing the bureaucratic machinery had absorbed his testimony and discarded him. Unwilling to wait for a hangman, Henry slipped out of his handcuffs, forced his way out of the holding cell, stole a horse, and vanished back into the high desert. The political betrayal finalized Henry's psychological detachment from any concept of societal order. He learned that the executive branch of the government was as duplicitous as the cattle rustlers he rode with. In response to the escape, Governor Wallace escalated the state's response from legal maneuvering to direct financial incentivization. Wallace authorized a bounty on the head of William H. Bonney, alias the Kid. The price was set at $500. In the modern context, this figure seems trivial. In the economic reality of the 1880 American Southwest, it was an astronomical sum. A highly skilled, experienced ranch hand working exhausting 14-hour days in the saddle earned roughly $30 a month. $500 represented nearly a year and a half of grueling physical labor, handed over in a single stack of gold eagles or crisp federal banknotes. This bounty fundamentally altered the geometry of Henry's existence. He was no longer simply evading a few local sheriffs. The $500 price tag weaponized the entire civilian population against him. Every drifter, every bartender, every desperate cowboy, and every former friend was suddenly presented with a life-changing financial incentive to put a bullet in the back of his head. The state had transformed him into walking currency. To survive this omnipresent threat, Henry retreated to the only environment that offered a semblance of camouflage, the sprawling, decaying ruins of Fort Sumner. Fort Sumner was a decommissioned United States military installation situated on the Pecos River. The Army had abandoned the sprawling adobe barracks and parade grounds years earlier. The decaying structures had been occupied by a marginalized population of Hispanic farmers, transient gamblers, and professional rustlers. It was a community operating entirely outside the surveillance of the territorial government, bound by a strict code of silence and deep suspicion of external law enforcement. Henry embedded himself in this community. He spoke fluent colloquial Spanish, danced at the local fandangos, and freely spent his stolen money in the cantinas. He formed a new tightly knit syndicate, often referred to as the Rustlers, focusing exclusively on stealing cattle from the massive herds owned by the northern syndicates and driving them across the desert to sell to illicit buyers in the Texas Panhandle. The proceeds from these high-risk operations were not invested or saved. They were immediately liquidated at the Faro and Monte table in Fort Sumner's saloons. The psychological toll of the $500 bounty manifested in extreme hypervigilance. Henry developed a paralyzing paranoia. He refused to sleep in the same location for consecutive nights, often making his bed in the brush outside the settlement or in isolated sheep camps. When he entered a room, his back was permanently fixed to a solid wall, his eyes tracking every movement near the exits. His survival depended on his ability to preemptively identify and neutralize threats before they could draw a weapon. This lethal pragmatism was demonstrated with clinical precision on the evening of January 10, 1880, inside Hargrove's saloon in Fort Sumner. The saloon was a dimly lit, low-ceilinged adobe room filled with the heavy smoke of cheap cigars and the sharp odor of unwashed bodies and raw whiskey. A stranger from Texas named Joe Grant had been drinking heavily at the bar for several hours. Grant was a professional bounty hunter, a heavily armed opportunist who had traveled to New Mexico specifically to collect the $500 placed on Henry McCarty's head. Grant was aggressively broadcasting his intentions, slamming his fist on the bar, and loudly boasting to the local patrons that he was going to kill Billy the Kid before the week was out. Henry McCarty was sitting at a table in the corner of the room when Grant made this declaration. Grant did not recognize the slight, boyish-looking teenager sitting mere yards away. Henry did not stand up and challenge the bounty hunter to a duel in the street. He did not issue a verbal threat. Instead, he employed the same calculated manipulation he had used to survive the slums of New York and the proxy wars of Lincoln. He composed his features into a friendly, disarming smile and walked over to the bar. He introduced himself to Grant under a false name, speaking in a soft, deferential tone. He offered to buy the bounty hunter a drink, deliberately playing the role of an impressed, subservient local. As they stood at the bar, Henry's eyes locked onto the weapon holstered at Grant's hip. It was a customized Colt single-action Army revolver, distinguished by expensive smooth ivory grips. Feigning deep admiration, Henry asked Grant if he could examine the weapon. Grant, intoxicated by the alcohol and his own inflated ego, drew the revolver and handed it to the teenager, eager to show off his hardware. Henry took the heavy weapon in his hands. He examined the craftsmanship, turning the gun over under the dim oil lamps. As his fingers traced the cylinder, his thumb discreetly depressed the loading gate. In a fraction of a second, utilizing the manual dexterity of a professional card cheat, Henry rotated the cylinder exactly one position. He had visually verified which chambers were loaded. By rotating the cylinder, he ensured that the next time the hammer fell, it would strike an empty chamber. Still smiling, Henry handed the weapon back. Grant holstered the sabotaged revolver, entirely unaware that he had just been disarmed. The tension in the saloon simmered for another hour. Grant continued to drink, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and violent. He began smashing glassware and threatening the other patrons. Finally, through the whispered conversations of the locals, Grant realized the identity of the young man he had been drinking with. Grant spun away from the bar, locking eyes with Henry. The bounty hunter's hand dropped to his hip. He drew the ivory-handled Colt, leveled the heavy barrel directly at Henry's chest, and pulled the trigger. The hammer snapped forward with a sharp metallic click. It struck the empty chamber Henry had carefully positioned beneath it. Before Grant could process the mechanical failure, before he could manually cock the hammer a second time, Henry drew his own revolver. There was no hesitation, no change in his calm facial expression. He fired a single round at point-blank range. The heavy lead bullet struck Joe Grant directly in the chin, traveling upward, shattering his jawbone and severing his brainstem. The bounty hunter collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, dead before his body settled into the sawdust. Henry McCarty calmly decocked his revolver, slipped it back into his waistband, and stepped over the corpse. He walked out of the saloon and disappeared into the freezing January night. He had not survived through superior marksmanship or honorable combat. He had survived by recognizing the lethal intent of an adversary, manipulating the physical mechanics of the threat, and executing a preemptive strike with absolute, chilling detachment. The $500 bounty remained unclaimed, but the echo of the gunshot in Hargrove's saloon signaled to the territorial authorities that the teenager would not be taken alive by opportunistic drifters. It would require a specialized, state-sponsored hunting party to bring the machinery of Henry McCarty to a halt. The judicial machinery of the New Mexico Territory finally processed Henry McCarty in April 1881. The trial, held in the town of Mazia, was a swift, highly orchestrated legal formality. The territorial government, acting on behalf of the railroad and cattle syndicates, required a public execution to demonstrate its absolute control over the region. Henry was not tried for his cattle rustling operations or his participation in the corporate violence of the Lincoln County War. The prosecutors isolated a single charge, the assassination of Sheriff William Brady. The verdict was predetermined. The judge sentenced the 21-year-old to be transported back to Lincoln and hanged by the neck until dead on May 13th. The location chosen for his confinement was a testament to the inescapable grip of the local monopolies. Henry was not housed in a standard jail cell. He was imprisoned on the second floor of the Lincoln County Courthouse. This massive two-story adobe structure had originally been built as the primary mercantile store and headquarters for the Murphy-Dolan faction, the very capitalist syndicate Henry had been hired to destroy 3 years earlier. The building that had initiated the proxy war was now serving as the state's death row. Sheriff Pat Garrett understood the lethal resourcefulness of his prisoner. Garrett did not rely on standard wooden doors or simple iron bars. He anchored Henry to the floor of a second-story office using heavy reinforced steel leg irons. The chains were riveted shut, preventing the use of standard keys. Furthermore, Henry's hands were secured with standard law enforcement handcuffs. Garrett then assigned a permanent two-man armed guard detail to watch the prisoner 24 hours a day. The two deputies selected for this detail represented the dual nature of frontier law enforcement. Deputy James Bell was a pragmatic, fundamentally decent man who treated the assignment as a professional obligation. He did not antagonize the prisoner. He played cards with Henry to pass the long hours and maintained a strict, albeit respectful distance. The second guard, Deputy Robert Ollinger, was a different mechanism entirely. Ollinger was a massive, heavily built enforcer who had previously worked for the Murphy-Dolan faction. He harbored a deep personal hatred for Henry and the surviving regulators. Ollinger utilized his position of absolute physical authority to engage in relentless psychological warfare. He routinely taunted the chained teenager, detailing the mechanics of the gallows and describing how Henry's neck would snap. Ollinger's primary tool of intimidation was his weapon, a custom side-by-side 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun. He kept the weapon loaded with heavy buckshot, constantly resting it on his knees or pointing it toward the prisoner, explicitly hoping Henry would make a sudden movement that would legally justify a point-blank execution. Henry absorbed the psychological abuse with chilling passivity. He did not argue. He did not issue threats. He sat on the floor, heavily chained, analyzing the architectural layout of the second floor, the schedule of the guards, and the mechanical tolerances of his iron restraints. He was waiting for a microscopic fracture in the security protocol. That fracture appeared on the morning of April 28, 1881. Sheriff Garrett was absent. He had ridden out of Lincoln to the neighboring town of White Oaks to collect taxes and arrange the logistics for the construction of the gallows. The courthouse was left under the sole command of Bell and Ollinger. At noon, the daily routine dictated a division of labor. Ollinger took the 5 other minor prisoners housed in the courthouse across the dusty main street to the Wortley Hotel dining room for lunch. Deputy James Bell was left alone on the second floor with Henry McCarty. The physical environment was momentarily reduced to two men, a flight of stairs, and a collection of firearms locked in an adjacent armory room. Henry initiated the sequence of his escape with a mundane biological request. He asked Bell to escort him downstairs to the outdoor privy. Bell, adhering to protocol, unlocked the heavy wooden door of the office. Henry stood up. He could not walk normally. The heavy steel leg irons restricted his stride to a shuffling metallic drag. Bell followed closely behind, his revolver securely holstered, maintaining a standard operational distance as they navigated the narrow, turning staircase to the ground floor and exited through the rear door of the courthouse. The execution of the escape occurred during the return trip. As they re-entered the back hall and began the steep ascent up the wooden stairs, Bell allowed the distance between them to close slightly. The staircase was narrow, enclosed by solid adobe walls, creating a tight physical bottleneck. Henry, shuffling upward in his leg irons, possessed a distinct physical anomaly that the federal marshals had failed to account for. His wrists were abnormally small, narrower than the span of his hands. Halfway up the stairs, hidden by the turn of the landing, Henry executed a maneuver he had practiced in the dark. Utilizing sheer physical force and a high tolerance for pain, he twisted his left hand, compressing the bones and skin, and violently pulled his wrist through the steel cuff. The friction stripped the skin from his knuckles, but the iron ring slipped off. In a fraction of a second, the power dynamic inverted. Henry spun around on the narrow stairs. He swung the heavy, loose iron cuff still attached to his right wrist directly at Bell's head like a medieval flail. The heavy steel struck the deputy, stunning him and breaking his defensive posture. Before Bell could recover his balance or draw his weapon, Henry lunged forward. The teenager's hands locked onto the butt of the revolver resting in Bell's holster. A violent, kinetic struggle ensued on the narrow wooden steps, two men fighting for control of a single piece of machined steel. The physical disparity was significant, but Henry was driven by the absolute necessity of survival. He wrenched the Colt revolver free from the leather holster. Bell, recognizing that he had lost the weapon and was trapped on a staircase with a condemned killer, turned and desperately lunged down the stairs toward the rear exit. Henry did not hesitate. He raised the stolen revolver, tracked the fleeing deputy's torso, and pulled the trigger. The heavy lead bullet struck Bell in the back, tearing through his chest cavity. The momentum carried the dying deputy down the remaining stairs. He burst through the back door of the courthouse and collapsed into the dirt yard, dead before he could call for help. The first phase of the operation was complete. Henry McCarty was armed, but he was still heavily shackled in a building situated in the center of a populated town. The sound of the gunshot had echoed across the street to the Wortley Hotel. He had less than a minute before Bob Olinger responded. A conventional fugitive would have immediately fled, hobbling into the brush to evade capture. Henry McCarty did not flee. He proceeded with the cold, methodical execution of a tactical plan. He did not want to merely escape. He wanted to neutralize the remaining threat and deliver a calculated message of terror. He moved rapidly to the armory room on the second floor, a room Sheriff Garrett used as his private office. Henry kicked the door open. He bypassed the standard rifles and revolvers. He walked directly to the corner of the room and picked up the weapon Bob Olinger had used to torment him for weeks, the customized 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun. Henry broke open the breech, verifying that both barrels were loaded with heavy buckshot cartridges. He snapped the action closed. Dragging his chains, Henry moved to the east-facing window of the second-story office. The window overlooked the side yard of the courthouse and the path leading from the Wortley Hotel. He positioned himself just behind the adobe wall, concealing his silhouette, and rested the heavy twin barrels of the shotgun on the wooden windowsill. He possessed the high ground, a superior weapon, and absolute situational awareness. Across the street, Bob Olinger had heard the muffled crack of the revolver. He dropped his meal, drew his own sidearm, and ran out of the hotel. He sprinted across the dusty street, rushing through the wooden gate and entering the courthouse yard, positioning himself directly below the second-story window. Henry McCarty did not fire immediately. He waited until Olinger was fully exposed in the open yard, entirely lacking cover. He wanted the deputy to possess total cognitive awareness of his own execution. Henry leaned his head out of the window, looking down at the massive enforcer. "Hello, Bob," he said. The words were delivered clearly, lacking any inflection of panic or rage. It was a simple conversational greeting. Olinger stopped sprinting. He looked up at the window. He saw the teenager leaning over the sill. More importantly, he saw the twin black bores of his own 10-gauge shotgun pointed directly at his chest. The psychological shock of the role reversal paralyzed the deputy for a fraction of a second. He did not raise his revolver. Henry pulled both triggers simultaneously. The kinetic devastation of a 10-gauge shotgun at a downward angle of 20 feet is absolute. 18 heavy lead pellets of buckshot struck Bob Olinger squarely in the chest and face. The concussive blast shattered his sternum, pulverized his internal organs, and physically lifted his massive frame off the ground, throwing him backward into the dirt. He was dead before the echo of the blast faded across the canyon. Henry stepped back from the window. The air in the office was thick with the acrid smell of black powder. He looked at the smoking shotgun in his hands. He did not drop it carefully. He swung the heavy wooden stock violently against the adobe wall, shattering the weapon into splintered wood and twisted metal, rendering it permanently useless. He then tossed the broken pieces down onto Ollinger's ruined corpse. It was a gesture of supreme contempt, a physical declaration of dominance over the state's apparatus of violence. The courthouse was secure. 2 heavily armed deputies lay dead. The population of Lincoln, having heard the barrage of gunfire and understanding the extreme lethality of the teenager trapped inside, barricaded themselves in their homes and stores. The street was entirely deserted. No civilian posse formed to storm the building. No local lawmen stepped forward to challenge him. The town was paralyzed by a profound collective terror. Henry had achieved total tactical superiority, but he was still immobilized by the steel leg irons. The rivets connecting the heavy cuffs to the chains could not be picked or slipped. He moved to the armory and located a heavy miner's pickaxe. He dragged himself out onto the second-story balcony overlooking the main street, remaining fully visible to the terrified town. For the next hour, Henry sat on the wooden planks of the balcony, methodically raising and bringing down the heavy steel pickaxe against the rivets of his shackles. The sharp, metallic ringing of steel striking steel echoed rhythmically through the silent town. It was the sound of a man dismantling the state's authority with brute force, knowing that not a single person in the vicinity possessed the courage to stop him. He succeeded in breaking the chain connecting the two cuffs, granting his legs enough range of motion to ride a horse, though the heavy iron rings remained securely fastened around his ankles. He armed himself with 2 Winchester rifles and 4 Colt revolvers, stripping the armory of its best hardware. He descended the stairs, stepping carefully over the coagulating blood of James Bell. He walked into the street, commandeered a horse belonging to the county clerk, and took several minutes to adjust the stirrups to accommodate the iron cuffs on his legs. He did not mount the horse in a frantic rush. He checked his weapons, surveyed the empty windows of the town, and slowly rode out of Lincoln. He did not look back. He rode directly into the vast arid expanse of the New Mexico frontier. He had executed 2 agents of the law in broad daylight, dismantled his restraints while the civilian population cowered, and casually ridden away. The state had attempted to process Henry McCarty through its judicial machinery, and he had responded by tearing that machinery apart from the inside. He was 21 years old, heavily armed, dragging the iron chains of the state on his ankles, and entirely alone in a landscape that had placed a price on his head. The final fatal hunt was about to begin. The escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse permanently altered the calculus of the manhunt. Henry McCarty had publicly humiliated the territorial government, executing 2 deputies and dismantling his restraints in broad daylight. The narrative of the charismatic, misunderstood teenage outlaw evaporated within the halls of political power in Santa Fe. The objective shifted from judicial processing to immediate, absolute termination. The state required a corpse to reassert its authority over the corporate interests and foreign investors who demanded a pacified frontier. For 2.5 months, Henry vanished into the high desert landscape. He eventually located a sympathetic contact, a ranch hand operating on the periphery of Fort Sumner, who possessed the heavy tools necessary to chisel the iron cuffs from his ankles. Stripped of the physical chains, a logical fugitive would have immediately ridden south. The international border with Mexico was less than 300 miles away. Crossing the Rio Grande would have placed him outside the jurisdiction of the United States Marshals and the reach of the $500 bounty. He did not ride south. The psychological profile of Henry McCarty reveals a fatal culmination of hubris and a profound underestimation of his adversaries. He had survived the slums, survived the corporate warfare of Lincoln, and survived the state's death row. This survival bred a toxic overconfidence. Furthermore, he was anchored to the Fort Sumner area by his deep integration into the local Hispanic community and an ongoing romantic entanglement with Paulita Maxwell, the daughter of the region's wealthiest landowner. He believed his network of informants and his fluency in the local culture provided an impenetrable shield. He chose to hide in plain sight, sleeping in sheep camps and attending local dances, entirely disregarding the fact that the $500 bounty had weaponized the very community he trusted. Sheriff Pat Garrett understood this psychological flaw. Garrett did not organize a massive, highly visible posse. He knew that the sound of a dozen galloping horses would alert Henry's network miles in advance. Instead, Garrett operated with the stealth of a corporate liquidator. He utilized the intelligence apparatus of the state, quietly applying pressure, distributing bribes, and listening to the whispers of informants who recognized that associating with the teenager was now a lethal liability. By mid-July, the intelligence directed Garrett back to Fort Sumner. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett rode into the outskirts of Fort Sumner, accompanied by two trusted deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney. They did not wear badges on their chests. They did not announce their presence. They dismounted outside the town limits and walked through the darkness toward the sprawling single-story adobe compound owned by Pete Maxwell. Maxwell was the epicenter of the local economy, a man who possessed deep ties to Henry, but whose primary loyalty was the preservation of his own wealth and status. Garrett left Poe and McKinney outside in the shadows of the deep porch. The sheriff quietly opened the door to Maxwell's bedroom. The room was pitch black. Garrett walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, waking the wealthy landowner. He began to interrogate Maxwell in a low whisper, demanding to know the exact location of the fugitive. Simultaneously, less than 50 yards away, Henry McCarty was awake. He had been sleeping in a nearby room within the compound. He was 21 years old, exhausted and hungry. He rose from his bed wearing only his trousers and a shirt. He did not put on his boots. He walked out into the cool night air in his stocking feet. In his left hand, he carried a heavy butcher knife to cut a slab of meat from a yearling calf carcass hanging on the Maxwell porch. In his right hand, he carried a self-cocking, double-action Colt revolver. The weapon was not holstered. It was gripped tightly, ready to fire. As Henry approached the porch in the moonlight, his peripheral vision caught the silhouettes of Poe and McKinney standing perfectly still in the shadows. The sudden presence of unidentified men triggered his paranoid survival instinct. He froze. He raised the revolver, pointing it at the two strangers. He did not know they were lawmen. He assumed they were local residents or ranch hands. He backed slowly toward the open door of Pete Maxwell's bedroom, seeking cover and information from the man who owned the compound. He slipped through the doorway into the absolute darkness of the room. The sensory deprivation of the bedroom was profound. Coming from the moonlit yard, Henry's eyes could not adjust to the pitch-black interior. He could not see Pat Garrett sitting motionless on the edge of the bed, less than 6 feet away. "Quién Henry asked the shadows. "Who is it?" He took another step into the room, the butcher knife in one hand, the Colt revolver in the other, tracking blindly across the dark space. "¿Quién es, Pete?" he asked again, directing his voice toward Maxwell's bed. Bypassing any verbal warnings or demands for surrender, the sheriff recognized the voice in the dark. He understood that a fair fight with Henry McCarty was a mathematical error that usually resulted in death. Garrett raised his own revolver. He aimed at the center of the dark mass moving in the room and pulled the trigger twice in rapid succession. The first heavy lead bullet struck Henry McCarty squarely in the chest, entering just above his heart. The kinetic energy of the round pulverized his cardiac tissue and severed his major arteries. The boy who had built a reputation on his lightning-fast draw, the killer who had manipulated and outmaneuvered heavily armed syndicates, was instantly paralyzed by a catastrophic physical trauma. He dropped the butcher knife and the revolver. He fell backward onto the wooden floorboards. gasped for a fraction of a second, and died. The second bullet missed entirely, embedding itself in the wooden headboard of Maxwell's bed. The immediate aftermath was devoid of glory. Garrett, terrified that the teenager might still be capable of returning fire, scrambled out of the room. He and his deputies waited outside in the yard until the silence in the bedroom was absolute. They procured a candle, walked back into the room, and illuminated the floor. The state's most wanted fugitive lay dead in a pool of his own blood, barefoot, having never even seen the face of his executioner. The disposal of the body was swift and unceremonious. The following morning, a local justice of the peace hastily convened a coroner's jury. They examined the corpse, formally identified the fatal wound, and officially absolved Pat Garrett of any wrongdoing. The execution was deemed a justifiable homicide in the line of duty. Henry McCarty's body was not transported back to Lincoln for public display. He was placed in a crude, cheaply constructed wooden box. He was carried to the Fort Sumner Military Cemetery and buried in the dry earth next to the decomposing remains of two former gang members, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder. There was no monument, no solemn procession, merely the swift burial of a biological hazard. While Henry McCarty was hastily buried, penny dreadful publishers and later Hollywood studios quickly transformed the ruthless killer into a romanticized symbol of American rebellion, arbitrarily inflating his kill count to 21. The historical record, however, confirms he killed exactly 8 men, primarily law enforcement officers and bounty hunters who stood in his way. The legal system has also refused to accommodate this myth. In 2010, the state of New Mexico unequivocally denied a posthumous pardon, ruling that the systematic murder of deputies could not be erased by historical nostalgia. In the end, the orphaned teenager who assassinated a sheriff from the safety of an adobe wall met the exact reflection of his own methodology, gunned down in a pitch-black room, his life extinguished before he could even register the presence of his killer.